Hello and welcome to our daily Bible study. We are currently studying the book of Acts, and today we're going to be reading and studying and unpacking together Acts chapter 12 from verse 6 down to verse 19. But before we start our study, let's just make sure we're familiar with our passage by reading that now. So that's Acts chapter 12 from verse 6 down to verse 19. Now on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers bound with two chains, and guards in front of a door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, "Rise up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself up and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your garment around yourself and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but was thinking he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now truly I know that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but she ran in and reported that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And they said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, "It is an angel. It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking. And when they opened the door, they saw him and were astonished. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he recounted to them how the Lord had led him out of a prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brothers." Then he left and went to another place. Now, when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. And when Herod had searched for him and he had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. An incredible passage, and because we're halfway through a narrative here, we're parachuting ourselves in, aren't we? And if you might not have been studying with us previously to this, let's just make sure we're familiar with what's going on here. We're now 10 years into the ministry, aren't we, of the apostles, since the death, burial and resurrection of Jesus. Now 10 to 11 years in, and here we've seen many attempts from the Pharisees, from the Sadducees, from Rome, to try and squash this movement because it has so much momentum. There's now more Christians on the earth than there are Pharisees and Sadducees, and both made up of Jews, Samaritans and Gentiles. And of course, the message that they're going around proclaiming is that we have a heavenly king. We follow the Messiah, the resurrected Christ, and our king is in heaven. Now, if you remember from our studies previously, there were only two things that Rome cared about. And of course, when we're talking about Rome here, we're talking about specifically Herod Agrippa that was in charge of this region here. The two things that he was cared about, and it was extremely paranoid about, as per the DNA of the Herod family, was about being overthrown. And the fact that these people were talking about having another king, this would have absolutely touched a nerve when it come to Herod Agrippa. Now, he found some common allies and wanted to please the influential Jews of the day, which were the Sadducees, who controlled the Sanhedrin, and of course the Pharisees as well, who outnumbered the Sadducees. He wanted to win favor with them. So the old saying that we always talk about, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." King Agrippa, who also was very insecure about his Jewish roots, being an Edomite, he always had one kind of thought that the Jews wouldn't really accept him as king because of his spurious kind of connection in terms of how he was a Jew. And if you've read Josephus's writings about that before, you'll know that he was actually reading the law at one point in history, and it come to a point where it says that the king of Israel has to be a Jew, and he wept as he was reading it, and suddenly the Jewish people started crying out to him and saying, well, don't worry about that, you are our king. And that is recorded in history. It was a point where it bridged this relationship between Agrippa, who wanted to appease his people to stay in power and to make sure that he was a popular king for these people, but he wasn't worried about having the favor of the Christians because they didn't have the type of power that he was looking for. It was the power of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, who were the scribes, and those that were the Bolshi members as well, in terms of the Sanhedrin with the Sadducees. So what did he do? He said, right, these other persecutions against the church haven't worked. We've already brought these leaders into the Sanhedrin before and told them not to preach the resurrection of Jesus and to talk about Jesus, but that hasn't worked. We've gone door to door, which was what Saul did before his conversion, the Apostle Paul. He was used to persecute the church as well, and that didn't work. In fact, that led to the diaspora, where all of these first Christians started spreading out to all of the known territories of the day. And of course, they were then able to spread the gospel with all of their friends. Once Peter had opened up the door to the Jews and the Samaritans and to the Gentiles, and the Holy Spirit fell upon all of these three groups, all of the people on the earth, then of course these people were then able to spread this gospel message far and wide to all of their neighbours in all of these new places where they were living. And that didn't work. So what did he do? He went out of his way to now focus his attention on killing the leaders, wiping out the leaders. He's thinking, right, if I can't squash this movement by scaring off the people, I'm going to do it by dealing with the leaders. And the first person to be dealt with was James, the brother of John, and part of the inner circle alongside Peter, who had shared many intimate experiences, teaching and mentorship, discipleship with Jesus. He was the first to be killed at the hands of Agrippa, and now they were saving Peter after the Passover celebrations, so that he could be paraded just like Jesus was in front of the baying mob who would be crying out for Peter to be executed. And this is where we find ourselves right now in verse 6 in chapter 12. It was on that very night, the night before, when the planned execution of Peter was about to take place, that very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, so this would have been the 8th day of the Passover, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers. He was bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. There's already been a prison escape under Antipas's reign, when the Sanhedrin wasn't able to keep Peter and the apostles contained, if you remember that before. So what's happened now? They're making sure that this isn't going to happen again. And he's got 4 squads now, 4 squads of 4. And they were taking it in turns, 6-hour shifts, keeping watch day and night. And 2 of these, so the squad was made up of 4, 2 people chained to Peter, 2 watching the door. And their job was to make sure that Peter would not be escaping. But the one thing to recognize here is, if me and you was to know our fate, he would have already been completely aware of what happened to James, his brother in the faith, before this. Now, he's knowing what's going to be happening in the morning. That would be enough to give many of us a sleepless night. But what's happening here is he's fast asleep. He's sleeping between 2 soldiers. And, that this isn't something that we can do in the flesh. This isn't something that we can muster up by being a super duper Christian. He is filled by the Holy Spirit, and he is hanging on to the promises that Jesus told him, if you remember in John chapter 21, that he will die of an old age. And Peter wouldn't have known this at this point here, but he does, in fact, have another 2 decades of his life before him at this point. But he is sleeping, resting, being filled by the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, and he is asleep between these 2 soldiers and bound with 2 chains, attached to the guards, and with 2 guards in the front, making sure that it would be impossible for him to escape. Impossible in the flesh. But verse 7, behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter's side and woke him up. So immediately an angel then wakes up. This is the evening before he's due to be executed. So great timing. He comes in, and as he enters, he pokes Peter to wake him up. And he says to him, rise up quickly. And as he says that to him, because remembering he's chained to the guards, these chains that were attached, keeping him attached to the guards, that were joined to the guards, they fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, gird yourself and put on your sandals. And of course, what does Peter do? He does exactly what he's told to do. He puts his sandals on, he straps them up on, and then the angel says to him, wrap your garment around yourself and follow me. And he went out and continued to follow, and he did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but was thinking he was seeing a vision. Now, it'd be right to think this, because this happened, in a couple of chapters ago, didn't it? You think about the vision that he had about Cornelius, and when the sheet came down with the unclean and clean animals, in Acts chapter 10, and how he was perplexed and confused in that moment with that vision, and how the Lord showed that to him in Acts chapter 10. He's thinking, is this another dream? Is this another vision? Very confused about what was going on. That's what it says here in verse 9. He went out and continued to follow, and he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but was thinking he was seeing a vision. And verse 10, and when they had passed the first and second guard posts, they came up to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. God's sovereign hand opens up this gate. Of course, there's no mechanical, electrical way of doing that today. Today we have electric gates, don't we? That as you walk towards them or drive towards them, there will be a sensor and they will automatically open for you. This technology didn't exist 2,000 years ago, but God's sovereign power, of course, did. And as they approached this famous gate, as they passed the first and second guard post, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city. It would have been well known by everyone, and it opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. The angel's work was complete. His task was to wake Peter up and to free him from his captivity, from his prison. That's now mission accomplished. So now Peter, in verse 11, comes to himself, and he said, now truly, I know that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. This is no longer a vision in his mind. He knows this is a reality. He now knows that he has not got the chains around his wrist in this moment. He's now a free man, and he recognizes that God has rescued him from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. What were the Jewish people expecting? That following morning, that he would be no more, that they would be getting rid of the leader of the apostles. And when he realized this, what does he do? He goes straight to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark. Now, Mary was a very common name in the first century. This isn't his mother Mary or anybody that we've met before. This is the mother of John Mark, who famously penned the Gospel of Mark, and he's the cousin of Barnabas. And she would have been a wealthy lady who had a house big enough to be able to contain this first group of believers here. And at this point, the church had grown so much that it had now started, the church had started using locations, satellite locations, if you like, these church groups, these assemblies in people's homes. This is where the first churches were born, in people's homes. And Mary was one of the stewards of that by opening up her house and having this group of believers. And this would have likely been a church that Peter would have served in, maybe that he belonged to, because what was his first thought? He went straight there because he knew that there would be believers there. And of course he was right, because what were they doing? And we was told in verse 5, the church came together and they were fervently praying for him. Well, that's where he went. And when he arrived, that's exactly what they were doing. Verse 12, and when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. This is now comical. Verse 13, and when he knocks at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Now, this is the gate of the courtyard, so that you would have had the front door, and that you couldn't have access because this was a gated house. So he's now knocking on the outer gate door, if you like, trying to get their attention. And it would have been a big enough house, and this is why we know that she was a steward of a well-sized property here, that could contain all of these Christians and would have been used. One of their giftings would have been that of hospitality and giving that up to be able to be used by the Lord as an assembly of believers came together in his house. And here he is knocking at the front of the gate, the door of the gate, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. So as they were praying, she left them and she would have come and looked over in the dark and seen that it was Simon Peter. She recognized his voice in the dark. She couldn't see him, but she could certainly hear his voice because of her joy. And this is just so funny. The first instinct would have been quickly letting him in. She knows, where he has been and the peril that he would have been in. But rather than opening the gate and quickly ushering him in, when she recognized Peter's voice, verse 14, because of her joy, she did not open the gate. She ran in and reported that Peter was standing in front of the gate. She went in and told all of the Christians that were gathering, praying for her, for Peter, that Peter's at the gate. And they said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting and saying that it was so. And they kept saying, "It's his angel." And even at that, you would have thought that would have been enough of them to jump up and if they believed it was his angel, because it was a common thought in the first century in that culture that people, every single person had a guardian angel, and they looked identical to that person. So they, in their mind, were saying, no, it isn't Peter, it's his angel. But yet they still didn't jump up in that moment to go and get him. It's just a funny thing to picture, isn't it? And you're out of your mind. And even though they were praying for this very thing, and it's a bit of application there for us as well, because we often pray, don't we, asking for God to, do something to intervene in our life. And sometimes we have a well thought out plan in terms of what that would look like, and almost pray these prayers, wanting God to rubber stamp it and deliver the prayer as we are requesting. But sometimes often God answers these prayers in different ways. And of course, we are so grateful for that, because he is infinitely wisdom and we are not, and his ways are much better than our ways, and they're not the same as our ways. So maybe they had an alternative view or vision of how Peter would be freed, and because this wasn't lining up with what they were praying or how they were expecting, they were discounting it, that this prayer, even though they were praying for him to be free, because it wasn't being done exactly like they thought, they were discounting it, that she is out of her mind, this slave Rhoda, and that she's out of her mind. And then they said, well, it's his angel. But Peter, being persistent and of course also being in danger, continued knocking, because he's on the outside of the gate here, probably looking over his shoulder, hoping that no Romans are going to spot him and obviously grab him and put him back into prison. Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him and were astounded. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he was going to be saying to them, shh, 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 be quiet. He recounted to them how the Lord had led him out of a prison. He told them the whole story, the whole narrative that we've just been going through, about how he was chained to the guards, and there was guards outside making sure he couldn't sleep. And then the angel came. He told them the account. And what did he say to him? He said, "Go and tell this account to James and the brothers." And of course, this isn't the James who has just been killed at the hands of Agrippa. This is James, the brother, the half brother of Jesus, who was saved after the death and resurrection of Jesus, who saw Jesus during those 40 days and became a very prominent figure in the early church. And he was one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. So Peter's saying, go and tell James what's happened, and the brothers, the other apostles as well, and the other believers. And then what does he do? Because obviously he's in great danger. He knows after a prison escape, there's going to be high alert. Everyone's going to be looking for him, and he's going to be dealt with, extremely violently if he was found. What does he do? He then leaves and goes to another place. Now, then it's at this point, we don't really hear a lot more about the Apostle Peter in the book of Acts. He comes back to Jerusalem after Agrippa dies, when he, I guess he views it as a safer bet to be able to come back in that time in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council, when this really important meeting takes place around the Gentiles and the Jews, and how they can be unity in terms of how the Gentiles are integrated into the church. And that's something that we'll be studying at a later date, and Peter comes back and is involved in that. But we know from other letters, through Paul's letters and through Peter's letters, that Peter then spends the next 20 years as a minister, going around to as an elder, going around to different churches, and in places such as Antioch and Corinth, in Asia Minor, traveling around, strengthening the believers for the next 20 years of his life. But verse 19, the next morning when Herod had searched for him, verse 18, when day came, so Peter's already left by this point, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. Can you imagine? Agrippa would have been going absolutely mad. And if you would have been one of those Roman guards who were given the specific task of making sure that Peter is contained and kept safe for what they wanted to do to him the following morning, there was no small disturbance. When Herod had searched for him and had not found Peter, he then turns his attention to the guards and he examines them. And then, when they're none the wiser and they've got no account of what happened to him, he orders that they be led away to execution. Of course, Agrippa, he's absolutely furious with them and holds them completely accountable for the escape, maybe even suspicious that they were involved in, because he certainly wouldn't have been believing in anything supernatural. But he has them executed, and then he went down from Judea to Caesarea, which was the Roman capital of this region, and that's where he then spent his time, because when we come back to our Bible study tomorrow, we'll see that he's got other international issues to be dealing with, and because he's not very happy at the moment, you can imagine that whole state of mind that he's in. He's not a very happy chappy. Hopefully that's been helpful. If you do have any thoughts, comments or reflections, as always, please do let me know in the comments below, and I very much look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Bye for now.